Seduction is a powerful weapon for self-defense and conquest. By learning how to use it, you open more opportunities, more doors, and of course, more legs. Stay with me until the end of this video, and I'll show you in depth why you should master this skill and become number one in people's hearts. There's a specific type of man who suffers more in the game of attraction. It's not the aggressive guy, nor the indifferent one, nor the reckless one. It's the well-intentioned man. The one who listened, absorbed, and tried to live exactly what he was told was the right path. He learned that he needed to be understanding, emotionally available, respectful, patient, and reliable. He learned to listen, to validate feelings, not to pressure, not to seem needy, not to overstep boundaries. And yet something doesn't fit. Women like him, trust him, confide in him, but they don't desire him. And the more he strives to be better within this mold, the more sexually invisible he becomes. This man's mistake isn't one of character. It's a misinterpretation of reality. He confused relationship criteria with attraction triggers. They are different systems, operating on different layers of the human brain. When a woman says she wants a kind, secure, and loving man, she's describing desirable qualities in a partner she already desires. She's not describing the factors that awaken that desire. This distinction changes everything, but it's rarely spoken aloud because it sounds too cruel for contemporary social morality. The truth is that attraction doesn't stem from correct behavior, it stems from emotional excitement. And emotional excitement is not synonymous with comfort. Freud already pointed out that desire arises from the tension between the known and the unknown, between the safe and the risky. The excessively predictable man eliminates this tension before it even arises. He presents himself as an open book in a world where mystery is still one of the few currencies of psychological value. The result is that he becomes agreeable, but not magnetic, reliable, but not unforgettable. Most of these men react by trying to be even kinder, even more available, even more correct, as if they were adjusting a broken algorithm with the same variable that broke it. This is where the tragedy deepens. Because kindness, when not accompanied by emotional presence and sexual energy, is interpreted by the unconscious as an absence of risk. And where there is no risk, there is no excitement. The human brain doesn't release dopamine for what is completely predictable. It releases dopamine for what challenges, surprises, and creates anticipation. That's why so many women find themselves attracted to men who rationally they know they shouldn't want. It's not a moral failing, it's a neurological mechanism. Robert Greene explains that the effective seducer never offers himself completely. He creates the feeling that being with him is an emotional privilege, not an automatic right. The well-intentioned man does the opposite. He offers himself entirely even before being chosen. And this breaks the dynamic of polarity. Polarity is not domination, it's energetic difference. It's the friction between two distinct poles. When a man adapts too much, he loses his shape. And without shape, there is no friction. Without friction, there is no fire. It's common to hear that women like men who make them feel safe. This is true but incomplete. They like to feel safe with men who have already aroused desire. Security without desire is friendship. Desire without security is chaos. The point is that order matters. First comes visceral attraction, then the building of comfort. Reversing this sequence is the fatal mistake. It's like trying to convince someone to invest in something that has never sparked curiosity. The brain simply doesn't engage. That's why so many first dates fail even when everything went well. There was no emotional conflict, no tension, no psychological risk. It was polite, it was pleasant, it was forgettable. The man who understands this begins to realize that attraction is not something you ask for, nor something you negotiate. It's something you provoke. Provoke not in the sense of manipulating, but of stimulating specific emotional states. States that take the person out of automatic mode and put them in sensory mode. The problem is that most men have been trained to avoid exactly that. They avoid tension, they avoid silence, they avoid ambiguity, they avoid strong emotions. They try to resolve everything too quickly. But seduction happens in the space between stimulus and resolution. When you resolve it too early, you kill the process. This is where another uncomfortable contradiction arises. Many women don't know how to explain what attracts them because the process is largely unconscious. They describe what they value, not what activates desire. And when a man tries to follow only these descriptions, he becomes functional, but not fascinating. Jung spoke of the shadow as that which we repress in order to be socially accepted. Desire often inhabits precisely this shadow. The man who excessively represses his assertiveness, his provocative humor, his physical presence, his ability to lead the interaction, ends up amputating the most attractive part of himself. Not because these characteristics are morally superior, but because they communicate life, direction, and autonomy. And the female unconscious is extremely sensitive to this. When you observe men who attract easily, you realize that they are not trying to please all the time. They are guiding the experience. Not in an authoritarian sense, but in a narrative sense. They create rhythm, they create atmosphere, they create an emotional story into which the woman enters almost without realizing it. If attraction begins as a visceral impulse, it only transforms into a real connection when it invades the mind. And that's where most men stumble again. They don't understand that, for a woman, the primary sexual organ isn't between her legs, it's between her ears. The female mind, when stimulated correctly, is more powerful than any physical touch. And the path to the stimulation isn't the content of what you say, but how you make her feel while you say it. This isn't modern theory, it's an ancient truth ignored by logical men. Since Plato's time, it's been understood that the human soul is driven by a combination of reason and emotion. But what few have grasped is that in most emotional decisions, it's feeling that leads and reason that only justifies afterward. And female attraction is one of those decisions. It's shaped by the emotional rhythm of the conversation, not by rational argument. A classic mistake is trying to impress women with data, achievements, explanations. This might work on LinkedIn, but not in bed. Because her brain isn't just listening to what you say, it's reading the vibration behind your speech. It's evaluating the subtext, the congruence, the tone, the cadence, the emotional security conveyed by your voice. This explains why men who are less intelligent, less wealthy, and less interesting on paper can have much more impact in reality. They've learned something that seems like art, but is applied emotional science, speaking on a feminine frequency. And this frequency isn't about what's being said, it's about what's being felt. The man who masters this frequency can transform a conversation over coffee into a ritual of tension and pleasure. Because he knows how to carry emotion in every syllable. He understands that each word is a vessel, and that what seduces isn't the vessel, but what's inside it. Imagine an actor reading the same phrase, "I want you." Depending on the intonation, this phrase can sound like a passionate confession, a threat, a plea, a provocation. The script is the same. The effect completely different. The effective seducer understands this. He's not trying to convince, he's trying to create a connection. He understands that seduction is more like playing an instrument than presenting an argument. And the woman, in this context, responds to the emotional sound more than to the lyrics. That's why many right men say the right things and still don't make any impact. They're out of tune. They're speaking at a frequency that doesn't activate her emotional receptors. And the consequence is lethal. She hears, but doesn't feel. She understands, but doesn't connect. She agrees, but doesn't desire. To correct this, the first step is to abandon logic as a guide for the conversation. You're not trying to win a debate. You're trying to provoke an emotional state. This means that sometimes silence is more powerful than a perfect answer. That a pause charged with intention is worth more than a predictable compliment. A well-held gaze can say more than an elaborate sentence. Seductive communication is made of subtext, not topics, of rhythms, not rules, of energy, not structure. And this is uncomfortable for men who have spent their lives training to be rational, clear, and efficient. Because here what matters is not clarity, but tension. It's the same principle that makes a film hold your attention. It's not the resolution of the scene, but the suspense between one revelation and another. The seducer creates this suspense in the micro, in each phrase, in each pause, in each half-restrained smile. He doesn't give everything away at once. He insinuates, he leads, he dances, and in this dance he creates a small parallel universe, an emotional space where only the two of them exist. Robert Greene calls this an alternative emotional reality. an intimate field where the rules of the external world are suspended. It's like a psychological bubble created between two bodies. Inside it, time slows down, logic weakens, and the senses are amplified. This bubble is the sacred territory of seduction, and it only forms when there is emotional surrender, but with tension, when there is connection, but with contrast, when there is attention, but not control. The key is to enter the woman's emotional reality without getting lost in it. It's knowing how to mirror feelings without becoming submissive to them. It's provoking emotion without seeming desperate for a response. The common mistake is trying to imitate this effect with ready-made phrases, rehearsed techniques, textbook psychological tricks. This may even work in the short term, but the woman senses when the vibe isn't genuine. Because what sustains this emotional bubble is not just what is said, but your ability to sustain uncertainty. Women are masters of implicit communication. They live in an emotional ecosystem where everything is read in layers. The tone, the ambiguity, the gaze, the rhythm. They perceive more than you say. They feel what you avoid saying. They decode the unspoken with surgical precision. And if you are emotionally flat, predictable, without contrast, you don't enter this ecosystem. You become invisible in the field where desire is activated. That's why an effective seducer is, above all, a man with inner control. He doesn't react to her every emotional fluctuation. He observes, welcomes, and redirects. He doesn't try to please. He creates atmospheres. He doesn't try to convince. He invites. He doesn't try to be perfect. He's authentic, but intentionally. This generates what I call narrative magnetism. The woman begins to wonder, who is this guy? And that question is the beginning of attraction. Not because he answered well, but because he created an emotional field where her mind began to project. And this projection fuels desire. Human beings desire what they imagine more than what they understand. And the seducer, unlike the explainer, leaves room for her to imagine. This space is created by strategic silence, by ambiguous answers, by well-measured provocation. It's not about manipulating, but about understanding the emotional architecture of seduction. That's why, often, the guy who speaks little but looks deeply has more impact than the one who talks too much trying to impress. A woman senses when there's something to be discovered. When the experience with that man isn't completely mapped out. When there's emotional risk, not physical danger, but the feeling that this exchange could lead her to a different emotional state than usual. That's what desire seeks. Not rational security, but emotional vitality. And you only offer that if you stop thinking like an arguer and start acting like an emotional architect. This architect understands that seduction is a non-linear script. When conversation turns to desire and the vibe builds, many men still believe they've won the game. But they're only at the beginning. Because, despite the emotional impact, there's a decisive factor that amplifies or negates everything else. The context in which you present yourself. And here we enter the most neglected, yet most powerful territory of contemporary seduction. The perception of relative value, not absolute value, not what you have, but where and how you position yourself in relation to others in the environment where she perceives you. And that changes everything. Imagine two men with the same charisma, the same beauty, and intelligence. One is seen in isolation at a party where nobody knows him. The other is seen on stage with attention directed at him, microphone in hand, or simply being the center of a small group. The internal content is identical, but the effect is completely different. Why? Because the second is surrounded by a context of high social value. Human beings by instinct do not evaluate value in absolute terms. They evaluate by comparison. The same wine seems more expensive when served in an elegant glass. The same dish tastes better when presented in an expensive restaurant. The same man is more attractive when positioned in a setting of social validation, prominence, attention, or leadership. This is called an alpha context, a psychological phenomenon where the one who dominates a small, however limited, social space becomes the center of attraction within that bubble. And here's the brutal truth. You don't need to be the most powerful man in the world. You need to be the most perceived man within your immediate territory. And that territory can be a conversation circle, an online environment, a stage, a social network, an event. The size doesn't matter. What matters is what you represent within it. The big mistake men who feel invisible make is that they place themselves in scenarios where their value isn't visible, and this destroys any advantage they might have. Because, in the eyes of women, desire ignites with clues of perceived value, not just by what you show, but by what others reflect in you. When you position yourself as someone of value within a group, something magical happens. You become a social magnet. Women aren't just attracted to who you are, they're attracted to how others treat you. It's the old law of authority by association. Robert Cialdini, in his studies on persuasion, showed that people follow behaviors almost automatically when they perceive authority. And authority isn't always formal. Sometimes it's symbolic. It's the tone of your voice, it's how you occupy space, it's how you behave when you're not trying to please. It's the naturalness with which you lead without asking permission. When you create this atmosphere around you, even in simple environments, you stand out. The woman feels she's in the presence of someone with leadership energy. And that stirs her instincts. Because in the sexual realm, selection isn't rational, it's instinctive. And the female instinct seeks the one who has the best chance of offering intense and memorable emotional experiences. And the most ironic thing is that this man may not have money, good looks, or formal status. He might be the artist playing at the corner bar, the content creator in a specific niche, the leader of a small group with strong engagement. The size of the stage matters less than the significance you occupy within it. The problem is that most men still think of status as a game of external achievements, car, watch, bank account. And they forget that, in the current scenario, these elements are not the only ones, nor the most effective. What matters is the perception of centrality. Who sets the tone? Who generates emotion? Who makes their presence felt? And this can be done with zero money, but with a great mastery of your emotional language and your social territory. It's the broke musician who, when he steps on stage, becomes the center of the universe for 2 hours. It's the ordinary guy who organizes valuable gatherings, leads a podcast, dominates a community. Women perceive this instantly because their instinct recognizes value contextually. And then they sense what we call an aura of selectivity. The man who seems to have options, who isn't desperate, who doesn't adapt to please, who leads his own universe. This aura is magnetic because it communicates emotional scarcity. And where there is scarcity, there is appreciation. This, incidentally, explains why many men who suddenly become famous begin to attract women who previously ignored them. Nothing has changed in their internal content, but the context has changed, and this reprograms the female brain. But you don't need worldwide fame, you need local renown, a context where you are perceived as a reference point. And this is within reach of any man who has the courage to emerge from strategic invisibility. Strategic invisibility is when you hide for fear of rejection, failure, judgment. You protect yourself, but you negate yourself. You avoid pain, but you also prevent any desire to meet you. Desire demands exposure, not physical, emotional, and social. And this exposure needs to be calibrated with presence, with identity, with expression of opinion, with authentic vibration. When you create your own stage, be it a social network, an influencer group, a tribe you lead, you become the alpha context. And in that context, you become the protagonist of the movie women want to watch. And look, it's not about becoming a performer or a narcissist. It's about understanding that the game of attraction is highly visual and symbolic. What she sees in you depends on the scenario where you position yourself. Women crave stories, and you need to become the main character in yours. What does she see in you when she observes you in any environment? An extra trying to be accepted? Or the screenwriter who drives their own narrative? That's why building context isn't vanity, it's strategy. And more, it's the differentiating factor of elite seducers. They don't wait to be noticed. They create the spaces where the female gaze naturally rests, whether with their energy, their leadership, their creativity, their emotional expression. Because when this is done authentically, there is no competition. What you represent in her imagination is unique, and that's what seduces. The singularity. The impression is that this man cannot be easily replaced. And how does she perceive this? By the way, he occupies social space. A man who is the center of his own story, who doesn't beg for attention, but creates the atmosphere where attention naturally flows. This man doesn't chase, he attracts, and that is much more powerful, because the woman feels she is facing someone who could choose any path, and yet chose that moment with her. This activates a deep emotional circuit, that of validation by choice. And choice only has weight when it comes from someone who has alternatives, and alternatives are visible when you have context. Therefore, the secret is not only in how you speak, as we saw in the previous chapter. It is also in where you are positioned when she sees you speaking. Context plus emotion equals absolute magnetism. That's the end game. And ironically, the point where many never reach, because they are too busy trying to qualify themselves instead of positioning themselves. The world is full of capable men. What is lacking are visible men. Men with a history, with presence, with a setting. Men who understand that seduction doesn't begin with conversation, but with perception. And perception is shaped by the setting. Build yours. But if there's one thing you need to take away from this video, it's this. The man who masters his own universe never begs for space in anyone else's universe.